This is the 10th in a series of short presentations that discuss some of the current myths in risk management. The primary purpose for managing risk is to improve decision making, so as to make it more likely that our subsequent actions will contribute as much as possible to the achievement of our goals and objectives. There really is no other purpose. However, unfortunately, some in the risk management profession seem determined to make the simple and useful concepts and processes that underlie risk management much more complex and opaque. This set of presentations seeks to demonstrate how confused and confusing is the way many in our profession explain how we should manage risk. Myth 10 concerns the large number of measures which some people think they have to create for risk. Obviously, there is a measure of the current level of risk, but people also want to report the residual risk, thinking that that is the current level of risk, but of course that is the level of risk after all treatment has been finalised. They then want the target level of risk. Many people believe passionately that they must put down the inherent level of risk, plus measures for maximum foreseeable loss, expected maximum loss, gross risk, and a measure called potential exposure. Indeed, when you look at the risk registers for some organisations, they have so many columns it's impossible to read across and understand the message being given. And I think the truth is we've lost sight of why we gather this information, if at all. So let's not lose sight of why we're doing risk analysis. We need to develop an understanding of the risk. That's the definition of risk analysis. And in that way estimate the level of risk as part of decision making. It's not there as a plaything for the risk manager. It's not there to generate data and graphs. It's to generate information that decision makers can use. In particular, we need the information to enable us to judge whether the level of risk currently is acceptable, and if it isn't acceptable, whether it should be treated and how it should be treated. To do this, we just need 3 pieces of information, no more and no less. We need some information about the current controls, those things that are in place now which actually modify the risk, not those things which we think might modify the risk or we just call controls, those things that actually modify the risk, and we need to know their effect and critically their effectiveness. How good are they at modifying the risk? Secondly, we need to know what is the level of risk now. Not at some bizarre point in the past where there were no controls in place, not at some point in the future when we might have completed all our risk treatment actions. We need to know the level of risk now. In particular, one of the things we've learned over the years is that the concept of inherent risk is inherently risky. You just don't need it. Everybody says, but you must measure inherent risk to judge how effective are the current controls. Well, why? They're already in place. They either modify the risk or they don't. We don't need to relate to some point before they were in place, because often those controls are just part of the business. They're going to be there anyway. One of the problems with inherent risk is while we can understand the inherent consequences, we can understand the consequences if you take controls away, we can't understand the inherent likelihood. What's the likelihood of the thing which we're using to characterize the risk, the event, the situation, the circumstance actually happening, if we took the controls away? Unfortunately, as we start taking controls away, we have to take all controls away, not just the ones we think about and not just the ones it's convenient. We have to take all controls away, including those controls which we think are inherent in the business, like people will actually do the right thing most of the times, or there is a culture, or there's basic training in place, or there is a system of discipline. So we have to take all of those away. And for what purpose? It just confuses people. The other measure of risk, which has a lot of interest at the moment, is some sort of target level of risk. And I can have some sympathy for this, that you need to understand whether the risk treatment measures you intend to put in place will actually change the risk, will modify the risk to the extent you require. But really, at the end of the day, the effectiveness of risk treatment comes down not to a level of risk at the end, but to a cost-benefit analysis that compares the change in risk to the various costs associated with achieving that change in the level of risk. We really don't need that target risk measure. And in fact, in many organizations, we're finding it's a disincentive. People inadvertently believe that the target risk is the level of risk now, and somehow it demotivates them to actually complete the risk treatment tasks. So we do need the current level of risk. And one thing we've learned is we do need some measure of foreseeable maximum consequences. Inherent consequences, if you like, or potential maximum consequences, we call this generally potential exposure. So we need those three measures. Some measure of control effectiveness, some measure that reflects the level of risk, and some measure which we might call potential exposure, which is the potential maximum consequences. And decision makers don't actually need any other measures whatsoever. So let's have a look now at how we might use those three factors. We see here a series of three graphs, and the first, if you like, is a matrix showing control effectiveness against level of risk. You will often plot consequence times likelihood matrices to allow you to combine measures of consequence and likelihood to come up with a level of risk. You'll see here three different matrices which also support decision making. The first one, we're looking at the effectiveness of the current controls and the level of risk. And what we need to know is, if we only have so much time and so much money, where should we go first in terms of risk treatment? And it is to treat the risks within that particular box. These are the low-hanging fruit. They're the risks at the highest levels where we are admitting the control is not as good as it could be. It is so far as is reasonably achievable, it could be improved. Relative to other measures, that area is where we should focus our attention. The second matrix shows the risks plotted for level of risk against potential exposure, where potential exposure is the potential maximum consequences or the inherent consequences. And despite common belief, assurance programs, whether they're conducted by managers who are the control owners and who monitor key controls, or by auditors who periodically sample controls to understand if the organization itself is monitoring and reviewing its controls effectively, those assurance programs are not focused on the highest risks. A lot of auditors still write in the reports that their assurance plan is risk focused and focused on the major risks, but in fact it shouldn't be focused on the major risk. It is truly assurance, and therefore it should be providing the organization with assurance that those risks which it believes are low remain low and have not drifted high, and therefore we should be looking for the controls that modify the risks that sit within the rectangle. They're the risks where we believe at the moment the level of risk is low, but where the potential consequences could be very severe indeed. And this is where we should primarily focus our attention in terms of assurance of controls, and the controls that sit there are the key controls that should be allocated to control owners for continuous monitoring, not just periodic review. And finally here, we've plotted control effectiveness against potential exposure. You'll see here there's actually no level of risk in this graph. We're just looking at four risks, the effectiveness of the bundle of controls that are present for each risk against the potential maximum consequences. Often we're asked, for example, what the executive or the board should look at in terms of oversight? What are the risks that they should monitor carefully? What are the ones they should be concerned about? And our answer always is it's those controls where risk treatment is active and needs to be progressed. And particularly those controls where we know the control effectiveness is low, but the consequences are very severe. You would expect senior management of the board to be quite anxious that those risks are treated as soon as possible. We've already admitted that the controls are certainly not as good as they could be, and if the event or situation or circumstance were to occur, the consequences could be very severe if the controls were not effective. And of course, we've said they're not effective. And therefore, the risks that sit in this rectangle are the ones that we believe should be the primary focus of management oversight, and in particular, managers or senior management should be receiving reports frequently that show that risk treatment plans are being progressed, that in particular the risks are no longer in that rectangle and have drifted to the right hand side because the control effectiveness has been substantially improved. Thank you.